Welcome to the Connected Leadership Podcast Live. I'm Andy Lapata. Really glad if you're joining us live. It's great to have you here, and please say hello in the comments, whether you're on LinkedIn, Facebook or YouTube. And as we go through the conversation to come, feel free to ask any questions or share your own experiences. I think today is going to be a very powerful conversation, and I think it may resonate with a lot of people. I'm talking to my good friend Nick Jonsson. I met Nick quite a long time ago, a number of years ago, when he lived in London and he ran a group called European Young Professionals. Nick and I met at a talk I gave at the Swedish Chamber of Commerce. And he came up to me after the presentation and said, I've got this new group of young professionals from all over the world. We meet and network in London. Would you come and give a talk for them? And I did that and made a lot of good friends and stayed friends with them through to today. And Nick, very much among those. Since then, Nick's travelling has taken him mainly around Asia, and he brought me in to work with him again in Vietnam in two different roles, I think, if I remember rightly. And he's now based in Singapore, where he runs a mastermind group for senior executives. One thing that I didn't know the last couple of times I caught up with Nick when we were in Singapore is the struggles that he'd faced and the journey he'd been on. And it turned out that while I was writing Just Ask, Nick was going through very much the similar sort of journey to the ones that I was sharing. And I referenced Nick's journey or work since as a result of his journey briefly in Just Ask. And he's got a new book coming out, for which he invited me to write the foreword, the book called Executive Loneliness, that's coming out imminently. And so it seemed like a good time to invite Nick onto the podcast to share his journey. So Nick, good afternoon to you. Good morning from us. Welcome to the Connected Leadership Podcast.
Thank you so much, Andy. It's great to be here with you today.
So just a reminder, if you're just joining us on Facebook, LinkedIn or YouTube, please say hello in the comments. It's nice to know you're there. If you're watching this on the replay, also please do comment as we go through, because I do look at them and do pick them up even after the event, and Nick's tagged, or Nick will be tagged in that as well, so Nick can pick up your messages and comments after the event as well. So Nick, I've given an introduction there and I've touched on your journey, but I can't do it justice. I mean, reading your book really opened my eyes. You know, we'd obviously talked and I had a sense of what had gone on by the stage, you know, that you sent me the manuscript, but I didn't know the extent of it. And reading the book gave me a very powerful insight into what you'd gone through. So I think it would be a good start to set the scene, so to speak. So can you just share your own journey, what happened to you and how you dealt with it and what led you to writing a book about it?
Sure. Let me give you a brief introduction to my story. So basically I was born in Sweden. I moved to Australia in the late 90s where I studied, and then I started my career in Asia since 2004, and living as an expat mainly in Thailand, Indonesia and Vietnam, and going from job to job, from country to country, which is quite common as you are an expat. You do a contract and assignment and then you move to the next job. And yes, I did a stint also during that time in London, which is when I met you, Andy. So I think living as an expat abroad, you don't have much of a safety net. You don't have anyone to protect you should you lose your job and so on. You're very much on your own, or you're heavily relying on the company, that the company are providing for you, all the permits to work there, the legal rights to even be in the country, the medical care, the housing and so on, is all provided to you. And that is something that I always was quite worried about. I was perhaps worrying too much about it. What will happen if, and what will happen if I lose my job? What will happen then? And that was something that was back on my mind. And I, of course, met people who have lost their jobs, and I could see the trauma it caused for their families when something happened when you're away from home. And then it happened to me. I was performing well in my role, but suddenly I lost my job. And what I did then was to try to cover up. I didn't want to reveal what had happened to my family and friends back home in Sweden. I tried to basically show a professional facade, not telling anyone what had happened. I felt this is my own journey. I have to find a new job now. And that's what I did. So I kept it all inside me, starting to have quite a lot of anger inside me against my company who did this to me. So rather than giving up and moving back to Sweden, I was fighting on in Vietnam until I got a new job. And that's when I met you, and I did well in that job for many years. I worked for a fashion company wearing that pink suit, I'm sure you remember.
Can never forget that pink suit.
Yeah. So that was a company I was with for 5 years, and I did well, so well that they actually promoted me to a bigger role to head up the company in Indonesia. And just as I came over there, I had moved my family over. My son was 5 years old, into the school. We just moved into a new house. Then there was new investors who bought the company, and they were laying off 300 people, including me. So that was the second time as an expat I lost my job in a foreign country. And that time it was just too much for me. It had already been a hard move to just move country. It took us about 6 months just to get the permits, and I was over there in Indonesia 3 months before my son and wife. So when we finally got together, it was starting all over again. And I was just not ready to handle that at that time. And I basically pushed away my wife and my son, and I said, why don't you go home to Sweden and just be there, leave me here, and I will find another job. So that was the start of my own journey, basically just isolating myself in a foreign country, and then trying to find new assignments. I jumped from job to job, and I was not feeling well. I started to go to the bar after work and drink beer instead of going for exercise. As you know, Andy, I'm quite a fan of cycling and running and swimming and so on, and I lost interest in that. I replaced my good habits with bad habits, and I started to hang around the wrong people, the people who were going to the bars after work instead of going for a tennis match, for example. It all changed. And by being then by myself and not having anyone really to speak to, I was very quiet, and I don't think we had much touch. And when I was in Indonesia, I didn't contact anyone. There was no one who knew what was going on apart from a few nice photos on Facebook. So that I found then another job, a great position as a general manager for a big medical company in Indonesia, big package. And of course, I was thinking, should I move back my wife and my son to Indonesia? But I kept saying, let's just wait. Let me pass the probation. And then it was, no, let me give it another 6 months just to make sure. So I was so insecure then, being in my third big role here, that what's going to happen? Will I lose my job again? So I never got back my confidence in myself or in the company. I started to lose trust in people, and I was just very sad, anxious, angry inside me. And it led to the point where my ex-wife, who it is now, we divorced, and my ex-wife and my son are still in Sweden today, now 5 years later, because of the journey that started then. And it went so bad that I felt so insecure in my job that I actually resigned from this job. Despite doing well, I resigned from the job, despite I didn't really have anything else to do after. So that is how my journey really started. And the three jobs, then the two I lost, and one I resigned from. And there I was lost, didn't know what was home. And I moved back to Vietnam for a stint to see, is that home? And it wasn't home. I just got more sick there, to the point where I moved to Singapore, and that's somehow where the turn came. And that is when I started to get better.
So, I mean, there's a lot of subtexts that we could look at there. So we'll try and sort of take it piece by piece. I think that the core theme of your story is about the isolation, about the disruption, and about not having an anchor that comes with working away from home, working as an expat. And you talk about the culture of drinking after work. Of course, we have that in the UK. You have that in Sweden. But in the expat world, it tends to be, in my experience, a lot stronger, a lot more a core part, because of, people don't have the community ties that they would do if they were commuting back home. They don't have the longer commuting distances and so forth. How much do you think this impacts people working away from their home more than people who work close to where they were brought up, or where their family are based, where they have those community ties? How important do you think those community ties are?
They are very important, Andy, and I have seen a difference in depending on which country I moved to. And you tend to, hang around the people you meet your first 1 or 2 weeks when you come to a new country. So if the first few nights you move to a new country and you go out to the local bar where you move in, or in the hotel you stay, you meet some friends, and maybe those are the few friends that you save the phone number and hang out with. But instead, if you really make an effort, and I've done this, especially now when I moved to Singapore, I made sure that I contacted the local running clubs before. I knew where the swimming pool club was, where my swim academy is, and I signed up for these things even before I was in Singapore. So I really prepared for it to make sure that I should end up in good company and have some good close friends with healthy habits. So I would say we are in charge of this ourselves, but it's easy to fall into not having a plan or strategy for your social circle or your relationships is set up to failure, right?
So it's there's a key element where it's down to you to find that community, to find the right community and commit to it. And you talked about how you let those good habits slip. What about the role of the organisation that's employing you? From listening to you and from reading the book, there's a balance to be struck between doing. It seems like if the organisation goes too far in trying to support you and does everything for you, they create the scenario that led to your struggles, because they create such a reliance on that organisation, such a reliance on the job, that you find the pressures of worrying about losing your job build. So where's the right line for that organisation to support people, to be there for their senior executives, but at the same time to give people enough freedom to get the independence that they need as well?
That's a big challenge, Andy. And in the expat packages, you also have a clause traditionally that if you are terminated, they also ship you back home. They including a container with your belongings to your home country. But the further you live away from home, the more scared you are about moving back home, because you maybe even forgot about the language. At least if I pick up a Swedish book, a business book at the airport, I don't even understand it. I left Sweden in the late 90s. So the business language is not what I know. So the fear of moving back is big also. So it's really hard, while the companies are trying to protect you by saying, well, we will move you back home here if you like. And they offered that to me, but I declined it because I was scared of that as well. I figured that my CV is probably more up to date here, wherever I was, and this is probably where I can get a new job. That at least was my decisions. Maybe they were driven out of fear. Maybe I should have tried. But yeah, I think but to answer your question, it's very hard for a company to help you the whole way. I mean, they can only do so much. And once I lost my job in a company, you cannot hold them accountable to pay for your housing and anything else left. You stand on your own feet in a new country. That is where the challenge is.
And that when reading your book, that seemed to be the biggest trigger for you, particularly when you took on that new role. And you had, we're going to be recording a podcast soon looking at imposter syndrome. And that seemed to be a big issue for you when you went into the new role, is that people were telling you that you were doing well, but you refused to believe them. And you weren't moving your wife and son out, and you weren't putting down those more permanent roots because you were almost expecting to be fired at any point. How much is that driven by the transitory nature of the lifestyle? How much do you think comes from somewhere else?
Yeah, I think that is an insecurity that I built up over many years, and as I said, also happening to me, but also happening to so many people. I think that is many of us expats have this underlying fear of this happening, and to the point where I actually addressed this. It's about a year and a half ago now. I went to see a psychologist, a therapist, to really discuss about this, and she also helped me as a coach to develop everything I could to be more on my own feet, to have more plan Bs and so on. And that involved everything from changing the kind of permit I'm on when I'm working in Singapore, that I have a personal permit which is not linked to a company, but something
Yeah.
should I, or if something happen here, I can remain in the country a few more months, for example. So there are things that we can do to empower ourselves, and I learned this the hard way. And but it's similar. Like most people would think that it might be good to have it in my apartment when I get older. At least I have some property or something that I can rely on. But of course, when you are in a foreign country, and most of these countries you cannot even own land or buy property, so you're just relying on paying expensive money often for rent and so on. That's part of the challenge as well.
So okay, so let's move on, and we've talked about the organisation, the employing organisation's role. What about other people? I want to sort of look at this from two perspectives. So first of all, how the book is called Executive Loneliness, and we're talking because of your experience about how this is impacting people who are working away from home. But executive loneliness is a challenge that hits a lot of leaders wherever they may be, whatever their circumstances. How much did you feel isolated in your role? Did you feel able to share your challenges with other people within your organisation or at peer level? Where did you get it wrong, and then where did you get it right as you started to build towards recovery?
I didn't share any of my struggle internally in the companies. I think, and in my book, I also share some survey findings where I asked these questions to executives in Singapore. If they were suffering mentally, would they talk to their company about it? And about 75% wouldn't talk to the company. And I fell in for that as well, because I was trying to prove myself. Even one of the jobs where I was laid off from, I was hired as a future managing director, and at the time I was the area sales director, I think was my title. So I was on my way to become the national sales director, and then I could be an MD. So you're sort of competing with other people in other countries at that level, and it's about who really is the most mature and ready for the next step. And to be seen as strong doesn't necessarily mean to be seen as vulnerable, and that is unfortunately the point here, that people are trying to show the best of them and want to show that they are tough, that they can go through hardships and deliver results. And that is what I learned, especially coming up and doing sales and business development. That is the culture. You got to be tough, and even if it's challenging times, even if it's a global financial crisis, you got to fight through it and deliver the results. So that's the school of thought that I've been brought up with.
And so you found yourself bottling up these feelings. You had no one to share them with at all.
That's right.
So I mean, I know that you agree with me now, and it's something that I talk about a lot at the moment. Everything that you've just outlined is completely wrong. Maybe that's quite a blunt opinion, but I feel very strongly about it. This idea that vulnerability is a weakness. Yes, there are times where you've got to give direction as a leader. Yes, there are times where you've got to show positivity, certainty, whatever it might be. But that doesn't mean you can't share with certain people. You can't build a network around you to give you feedback, to act as a sounding board. It doesn't mean that you can't ask for inputs from all different people. At what point did you recognize that, and how has it changed the way you engage now? And how about the leaders that are members of your EGN network?
So, I mean, even since I knew you way back, and I was never shy to ask for help, especially if it came to business development, networking opportunity, relationships, opening doors. That is, some of my strengths are right there. But what I didn't do, I didn't ask for help about the things that were perhaps the ones I needed help the most with, the things that would show myself as vulnerable and show myself as weak. I had not learned to share those feelings with someone. Being in Sweden, we are quite distant people. We don't really open up. We don't talk very much deeply inside families, for example, especially in our generation. So I wasn't brought up with that. And living then away, moving from country to country, I never developed very strong friendships with anyone that I would open up with. So it only came after my crash when I learned to open up step by step. That is what it took, and it's now 3 years ago. I was in the middle of it.
And it's interesting that you say being raised in Sweden had an impact on your ability to be vulnerable and open up. It's one of the questions I get asked a lot and looked at in the book. Do you see cultural differences? Because obviously you're working in a melting pot of people from all over the world. Do you see differences in the way people approach this, and can you pin it down to cultural or gender differences?
I think it definitely can be based on the upbringing, how your parents were treating this and how they opened up about it. It can also be if you have a religious background, for example, come from a religious family, then these kind of matters might have been discussed and dealt with in a different manner as well. And yes, per gender, I think what I've seen and even the research, and it's inside my book, I have a chapter talking about this, that women seems to be a little bit more open. They have a few close friends who they really will talk to, and the ones who are struggling are especially men in the mid-40s up to perhaps early 50s, expat men. If you're single as well and living and working in Asia, then you're basically doomed. The best is to pack your bag and move home, as I say in the book.
Very blunt advice. So you're now running mastermind groups for senior executives. This is obviously, and I've spoken for your EGN group in Singapore, and it's very clear that everyone understands your message and your philosophy. How did you introduce that? Because people, I'm guessing, didn't join the mastermind group for constant conversations about vulnerability. Although a mastermind group, you know, for most people that you need that to make it work. Not everyone will recognise that coming in. How was your message received originally, and have you seen people come on a journey with you?
It has been positively reviewed. When I first spoke about it, it was when a colleague and friend of mine died from suicide in 2019. That's when I decided to really speak up about this. And my first message was a video on LinkedIn that went viral. It had instantly 35,000 views, hundreds of comments, and people wrote to me privately and so on. And everyone said, yes, thank you for talking about this. This was way before COVID, and no one else was talking about it at the time. The fact that I was vulnerable and that was so well received, and that instantly people came to me, and that's what ignited me to actually do a survey of senior executives in Singapore to really find out, because I thought when I got such strong response here, there must be more underlying issues and I'm not alone to have had these feelings. And that was my intention then, to really, with this survey, to find this out. And the survey led to more than 50 interviews where I spoke with senior executives, and I was just shocked by the result.
And when you started having that conversation, so you had people reach out to you as a result of the LinkedIn posts and so forth. Have you had any resistance? Have people been stuck in that space of no, you don't show vulnerability, or has it purely been positive?
It has been highly positive. There was one or two of the members who didn't renew the membership of EGN. They felt a bit uncomfortable by having these conversations about suicide and so on. But that's, we're talking two out of perhaps a few thousand who come forward and support it. I mean, instead, when I did that post, that video, I was instantly contacted by many of the chambers of commerce, the Singapore Women Association, and many other speaking organizations. And I was invited to give my keynote about 20 times as a result of this And as I then presented the survey findings, and I got so many people saying how great it was that we spoke about it, that's what then encouraged me to start even writing the book about it.
I mean, I think it's great that you're doing it and putting it out there, and I'm not surprised at the response you're getting. You touched on COVID and the impact of COVID. How do you think that has impacted executives, and do you think people are more likely to share their own journey and their own story now?
So I did a survey before COVID when I basically asked the executives, are they depressed or have they ever been depressed? And they 30% of them said yes. And I did the same survey now to the same group of people in December here 2020, so in the middle of the pandemic, and that had doubled to 60%. So that obviously shows that as business leaders have gone through some extremely challenging times. They've been dealing with big layoffs and so on, and it's been extremely difficult times for senior executives. So yeah, I'm sure that it's had a huge impact, and I've seen it firsthand. I have I've heard about suicides. I have friends who even died from suicide during the pandemic from isolation.
I'm really sorry to hear that, and it has been very tough on a lot of people. I think it's really positive that we're talking about it, and that's going to help us going forward. Do you see this leading to a permanent change in the way that we address these issues? Once COVID's history, something we talk about, do you remember when? Will we go back to normal?
So sadly, people still don't feel comfortable to talk with the companies about it. And I also asked that question. I got the same findings as before. So despite that people are more depressed now, they are not ready to talk to the company about it because they're perhaps even more scared to lose a job now when the job market is a little bit challenging, and it's even difficult to move home to your country now with COVID restrictions and quarantine and so on. It's very, very difficult times for relocations overall. So indeed, that hasn't changed much. What has changed are a few people stepping forward. Like myself, I already started this journey before COVID, and I haven't changed my plan. The book is coming out very soon, but others are now also coming forward, and it's very few. But in my book, I have interviewed a few people who are even ready to step forward with their names and title, and they've been featured in a few magazines and newspapers and radios where we had some interviews in the last year. So COVID have had a small positive effect that we are a little bit more open, but not enough.
Yeah, that's my fear as well, is that we're going to just go back to old habits, and you and I have got to keep banging the drum and encouraging some change. So with the work you've done on the book isn't just sharing your story, it shares your story, but it shares advice and guidance on how to deal with this moving forward. So what would you say to individuals who find themselves in the position you were, where they're feeling insecure, they're unsure of their future, they don't feel able to share with other people? With the pandemic, it may well have added an extra layer to that, and they're worried about looking weak by sharing those challenges. What sort of 5 steps could they follow to get them out of that vicious cycle and into a more positive one?
Well, one thing that I clearly clarify in the book, and the lifesaver, the turning point for me, was when I started to speak. First speaking to myself to even understand that I need to speak up, and then I started to tell my new wife, who I got married to and then I started to seek help. I started to go to a doctor, share to a doctor what had happened. That led me to a therapist. That led me to join an anonymous support group where I started to share my story. And for every time I started to share my story, I felt relieved afterwards. And I realized very quickly that people could indeed help. So it was very, very quickly, from lying in my bed thinking that I was going to die, I basically turned everything around. In a couple of weeks, I had the biggest hopes and drives and motivation than perhaps I ever had in my life. It was like just switching on the light. It was just from black and white.
So get out there, talk about it, get some people around you who can support you, and stop being on your own effectively.
Yes.
What about organisations? What can organisations be doing to change their culture and to encourage people to reach out?
So in my case, the organizations that I then started to speak about it was indeed a support group. You have many of these support groups in Australia. There's one there where I gave my keynote recently called Mentoring Men. You have many of the anonymous support groups. I joined one for problem drinkers. I picked up a drinking problem at the time, and that was a fantastic community where I was encouraged to be anonymous and share my stories and get support from others who've been there before. So depending on what your problem is, there are a lot of support organizations there that you can speak to. But of course, what really helped me as well was indeed the therapists as well. You can of course join also networking organizations such as the Chambers of Commerce and so on. And what we have done at EGN, because we know that people are quite shy when they are joining, we make sure and we carefully select a peer group with the new member. We don't just allocate them, you belong to this peer group. We show them a few groups and they can select, and then we send their profile for approval to this peer group. And then when they're introduced in the first meeting, they are basically need to share their expertise they're bringing into the group, and they have to lay on the table one of the challenges they are faced with right now. And we then, and our share is working with them to prepare for this. So it's a small presentation where the first thing they ask is to be vulnerable, to put something on the table where they are struggling inside the work, so that basically the first thing that is happening in this meeting is that the other members of the group will help them to solve this problem. So they will walk out of the first meeting feeling that, wow, I finally let go of that I've been holding on my chest for so long, and it was amazing, everyone helped me. So when you create this culture internally in an organization where everyone is encouraged to share honestly and deeply, then magic happens. What we also do is we get everyone to sign a non-disclosure agreement so that everyone knows that this is a safe and protected place where you're encouraged to open up. And yes, we are not talking about the deep mental health related issues necessarily inside the meetings, but it can be a huge conflict which you have with your boss or your team. Something might have happened in the company and you cannot discuss this with your boss because the problem is perhaps the board or the owners or the boss himself. Then this is your safe place to solve this before it becomes a major issue that you might go and drink over and not sleep over. So that is what we're working with. So any organization like that will be of huge support as well.
So I a couple of things that I got from that is I think that you encouraging people to be vulnerable and share something straight away sets the tone, sets the expectation. So there might be a fear for some that you're throwing people in at the deep end, but in some ways that forces them to swim as well. And I guess you don't have to share your deepest vulnerabilities at that stage, but it's just about getting people used to the process. The other thing is that you talked about going to external organizations. So I guess it's inherent on companies to encourage their leaders and their teams generally to seek support and to find places they can open up, but they don't have to host it themselves. They can just signpost people to somewhere where they can find the help that they need. Would that would fit with the way you would approach it?
Yeah, certainly. And there's many organizations, even as an expat. If you're away, I gave my talk last Monday to one of the Rotary clubs here, and they have groups of 8 who can meet now here during the COVID regulations, and where they are speaking quite openly. And they invited me to share a little bit about my story to even create more openness. And it just shows that the more we actually share our stories, if we're taking the lead here, then someone else will feel, well, next time it's my turn to share my story.
Great stuff. Now, very quickly before we wrap up this part of the interview, if you're watching live and you're posting comments, I see on my screen there is an error loading comments, so I can't see your comments. So I apologise for that, but please do keep posting them, and Nick and I will look at them afterwards if there are some there on LinkedIn, Facebook or YouTube. we're going to move on in a moment. I'm going to wrap up this main interview, and Nick and I are going to have a shorter interview, more about professional relationships. So when I say goodbye to Nick, please hang around and keep watching us. That's a little bit behind the scenes for everyone. So Nick, when is the book out? When can people get a hold of it?
It should be out in about 1 month. We're working on the layout now, and then it will go to Amazon after that. So it's very close.
Fantastic. So it's Executive Loneliness by Nick Jonsson. That's Jonsson. So make sure you keep your eye open for that on Amazon. Nick, we're going to talk to you again about your professional relationships and the highs and lows of those over the years, and other books you'll recommend, and that will be out in our Thursday podcast. But for the moment, thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you very much, Andy.
Great. So I'll just reset my timer, and we will go straight on with that other interview if you're happy with that. Apologies for anyone who is following. It's frustrating because I love the engagement. Then maybe everyone's still sort of getting started on their days, and there isn't any. But it says there's an error loading comments, so I have no way of knowing. I'll find out afterwards. Nick, thank you for that. So we're going to. I'm just going to ask you 3 questions. We'll see where the conversation goes. But we'll start off with looking at the positive role relationships have played with your career to date.
Okay, thank you, Andy. So the positive relationships, I would say, I think the strength, Andy, and that's why I met you already back in London 2006. I always reached out to speakers, presenters, and coaches, and I built up a big network of them all around the world. And I think that's how I built EYP, and that's how I invited you back in London to give a talk there. And I still do the same job today, basically, at EGN. So that has helped me tremendously, and that is, I think, where my passion is, by trying to match, people like yourself who have an amazing product and a good platform and a nice talk with the right audience. So that has now, even 15 years later, is still what I'm doing, and I will keep doing that.
So for you, it's a constant stream of reaching out, and from the sound of it, taking yourself out of the equation is a phrase that I use, a little bit of matchmaking. But that's, what sort of opportunities have come up for you in your career as a result of building those connections previously?
I have used these connections in my work in different ways. It doesn't matter which company I work with. I still found in 3 or 4 organizations I managed to use the same people. One of them is a fantastic public speak trainer, and since I worked in sales and management teams, I always needed someone who can train them in public speaking. And this gentleman would fly from India to Philippines when we did it there, to Indonesia, and I keep coming back to the same contacts, and that's why I guess I keep coming back to you, Andy. We worked in London, you supported me with EYP, we linked up with the Swedish Chamber of Commerce, and in Vietnam, I think it was 3 different occasions. It was with the company I work with, but 2 other organizations, and also with the media. And now, hopefully in Singapore as well, when travel is back on, I'm on the outlook to think about how can we get Andy to Singapore.
What's really refreshing is that for a lot of people, when they think of the word networking, which is a word that I've moved away from for a large degree because of the negative preconceptions about it. When they think about the word networking, they think it's people looking to sell. What you're referencing is people buying and having trusted suppliers. And it's easy to forget that a business balance sheet has 2 sides to it, hence balance. And you want to know that you can bring in people who are going to provide you with value for money, who you trust to deliver what you're looking for. And having that peace of mind can be key as well. So having your network in place to provide the right suppliers can be as important as bringing in prospects for you. So, it's just refreshing to hear you position it like that. Relationships don't always run smoothly. And things can go wrong. So where has it gone wrong for you, and what have you learnt from that?
relationships goes wrong when you don't have a plan for it. I think you need to have a strategy around relationship building. As everything else, it's a two-way thing, and you cannot only take and ask. You have to be there to support and guide others when they need you as well. But yeah, the relationships you end up when you're walking into the wrong bar or the wrong place, and you might continue to start a relationship on the wrong basis. And again, referring back to perhaps the pub or the bar, joining the local darts team might not come with the best habits and the best relationships. At least that was the case in Asia when I joined those places. It just didn't have any good effect for me. But when I join a swim squad, for example, that great things come from that. It seems like healthy habits leads to healthy relationships.
And you talked about that in our Monday podcast interview, when you said that you fell into the wrong company and you dropped your good behaviour and replaced it with negative behaviours. There's an oft quoted comment that whatever you achieve is equal to the 5 people you spend most of your time with. And I think one of the things clear from what you've said there is the importance to you of finding people who share positive values with you and finding people like that. How did you approach it when you had to shift relationships? You recognised what had gone wrong and you needed to lose those toxic relationships. How did you handle that?
Well, in my case, many times it was moving to a new country, and then I was really thinking about it in a strategic way before. And as I mentioned also when we spoke last time, was that I even prepared before I moved to a new country by joining the right clubs and reaching out by email before, connecting with some people to really have it planned rather than just ad hoc and by luck. But to move away from some people, just the standard stop replying and so on. I haven't had an opportunity to face someone when I had to tell them, really, I don't want you in my life. I think that's not going to make anyone happy. So sometimes you can just quiet things down and slowly walk away and move away from it and select some other people to fill your life instead.
Have any of those people who you feel that didn't share your values or were pursuing the wrong behaviours, have any of them heard you speak about your journey since then? And said anything to you?
Yes, a few of them are following me on social media and so on, and there's been perhaps a few who's been questioning my journey, because what I did then 2.5 years ago was to really address and look at myself with a fitness coach and also nutritionist and so on, to look at what do I need to change in my life. And the diet was a big thing. I had to lose 20 kilo, which I did, and alcohol had to go. And I have not had any alcohol for 2.5 years as of now. And that was a decision I had to make in order to turn my life around. And yes, I might have lost a few friends over that decision, simply because I don't want to go and spend time in the bar after work. And I don't miss those relationships. A couple of the good friends that I did used to go to the bar and drink with, they are still remaining as my close friends, and they're supporting what I'm doing. And even a few of them said, make sure that I sign a book and send to them when it's ready.
Oh, that's great. I've been through a similar journey. I was never a massive drinker, but I drank. And I drank socially, heavily on occasions, so some binge drinking, particularly around football or parties. And I've had probably 2 half glasses of beer when there's been leftover beer when I've been cooking in the last year. That's all I've drank in the last year. I'm not teetotal, but I'm pretty much teetotal at the moment. And it is interesting how, it's not the first time in my life I've done that, but it's interesting how some people don't get it and they define you by your ability to drink copious amounts of alcohol, while others like you for who you are. And if you want to drink a lime and soda, you drink a lime and soda. That's absolutely fine. And it's a good way to find out how strong a friendship really is, what people value you for.
Yes, I agree with that.
Yeah. Okay, and then finally, on the short podcast, we look at the books and the podcasts and the talks that have really had an impact on you, and we're trying to build up a library of great recommendations, great resources. So what are you going to add to our library?
Well, Andy, I have to say, through my support groups, I got a lot of great material. So that's where I've been following. A lot of it is the anonymous sort of the steps. That's where I've been finding a lot of materials. Otherwise, I've been a big fan of simplicity. Brian Tracy, for example,
Yeah.
who I had the pleasure also to bring to Vietnam twice. If I'm off track and I need to find my path back, picking up one of his books is just fantastic, such as goal setting. If you need to, kickstart something, you need if you don't have a coach by your side, at least a simple book like the one of goals by Brian Tracy, so you can set some measurable goals for yourself and keep achieving and getting back on track. That has really helped me. Other than that, I do like audio books simply because I can take them when I'm running or exercising. And there, I'm trying now to build some wealth because I have lost jobs, moved countries, divorces. I don't have much to stand on these days, so I need to try to build something up again. And there is the classic is the simple one, The Rich Dad, Poor Dad. I like those books. Just try to learn a little bit about investments.
Yeah, I remember. I read Rich Dad Poor Dad many years ago, and it's a very powerful book. Well worth reading. Nick, thank you very much. I think your message is very powerful. If you're listening to this on the podcast, then please do check out the longer interview with Nick on the earlier podcast where we talk about his journey and his new book, Executive Loneliness, which is coming out shortly. But in the meantime, Nick, keep, as I said on the Monday podcast, keep plugging away, keep banging the drum. I think it's an important message, so let's keep getting it out there. Thank you
very much.
And thank you if you've been listening and commenting, and I'm sorry I haven't been able to see them. But do join us again for another Connected Leadership podcast live very soon.